has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism. Listeners, we are back. My gut has been quieted by a Diet Coke, so I'm now a true startup Aristos.
No caffeine.
No caffeine, actually. So maybe actually D-cells here at in the HomeDAO house. But Josh, what we described so far in earlier was that clearly there is a class of highly capable, highly agentic, highly driven, a new Aristos, the good, the people who can go out and make changes in the world, but Samuel Bouya calls them live players, the new Normans, right? Had you been born several hundred years ago, you would have donned a peaked helmet, swung your axe over your shoulder, and gone and conquered the kingdom of Sicily.
You're a very Anglo-Saxon physiognomy, I would say.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
A very sound. Okay, maybe you would have stood on the hill with Hardrada and have been
stout, bony skull.
I don't know about you guys. I'm not particularly ethno-determinist.
This is a purely physiognomy-based analysis, But does I suppose the question that I having nattered on is, are we in a world now where this is like the aristocrat as a leader versus the aristocrat as an exploiter, right? Because there are two different views of this, and part of the skepticism of why we have to bring in everyone is that there has been a class of people who have been entrenched. Their power is comes from where they're born, and it's basically unearned. Clearly you probably sit on one side of this.
No.
Go on. I'd be interested in your views on how you think HomeDAO relates to this idea.
Well, it's always an evolving idea because there are lots of different, like we've said before, tensions, let's say. So actually the idea of noblesse oblige seems to come quite late on, or at least the formalization of the idea. And maybe actually people who inherit the wealth or inherit whatever their status is sometimes are actually less likely to be zero-sum or sort of exploitative because they feel like they haven't earned it, and therefore they should respect the fact that other people are in a worse position than them through no fault of their own. So maybe this is actually the real root of the disagreement between Tory dries and wets or whatever, where if you look at, I think it was Gilmore or something, Sir Anthony Gilmore did this speech around just before it all kicked off in the Thatcher government around how they were going to cause these social changes were going to cause loads of division in the country and loads of rupture. And if you're a Thatcherite who maybe you're just a greengrocer's daughter or something, who's seen the grind that's necessary and the sort of the constant toil that's involved with becoming productive and accumulating capital, essentially, then you're going to have much less sympathy for someone who is, say, on the dole or who's just hit hard times and hasn't been able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever the phrase is. Whereas if you're landed in some way or another, one, it's less authentic of you to say, just pull yourself up, because you've never had to do that yourself. But secondly, also, you don't really have any incentive, or you're sort of, if you were to calculate it from your position, you'd say, well, sure, maybe in principle, we should encourage people to just get on their bike and get a job. But equally, if we do that too much, then there could be a big revolt and we lose all our money. So maybe a bit of extra tax or something. Maybe actually giving people money that just keeps them docile, even if it's not good for them, is better for us. So there's this sort of I don't know the psychology of it fully, but it seems like some of that is at play when it comes to the inheritance, because there's the question of what's good for each part of society when you talk about the elite class that runs it. And apart from the Corn Laws, we seem to have had a really good history of sort of incorporating new elites post William the Conqueror, incorporating new elites into the country in a way that hasn't just torn apart the fabric entirely. Whereas in a lot of other contexts, it seems to be a lot more combative, where they don't want to cede any power to this new class.
There's the book, the Decline of the Industrial Spirit, that talks about how the industrial elite sent their children then to Eton and to Oxford, and then they became more country than country. You know, they spent their money buying big piles in the country rather than maintaining that spirit, which, you know, you're right, probably is good for stability, but actually doesn't lead to the continuation of that sort of entrepreneurial instinct.
Or perhaps just the instinct continues, but without the same dynasty holding on to it. So maybe it's actually better than expecting sort of an entrepreneur's great grandchildren to be going to the moon or something, because the circumstances that they're not really genetic necessarily, the circumstances that push people.
Meme, I'm sure.
Right, yeah, and sort of maybe it's just about having enough social mobility such that you can have new people breaking into that class. Like if you look at most of the really successful entrepreneurs, I don't have the numbers on this, but in this of the most recent generation, and this might just be me sort of shopping my own bag in a sense, most of them are Northerners, and most of them like you've got Sir Jim Ratcliffe, you've got Sir Mike Ashley, you've got Cordwell, the Phones for You guy, there's, I think his name is Platt, the guy that runs Bluecrest Capital Management. There are loads and loads of them. I'm sure there are many that I've missed, and many of them come from quite humble backgrounds themselves and are not, as far as I'm aware, from any sort of industrial heritage or anything like that. Maybe they're surrounded by it in terms of the towns where they grew up, but their parents often had just quite ordinary jobs. So I don't think you really need to pass it on through the generations. It's not like governance or things like that. So entrepreneurialism is not something that needs to be hereditary.
Well, I mean, the model, right, is you would now is if you set up, say, Pimlico Plumbers, you probably then send your children to go and be consultants or work in the city, right? And I wonder, do you feel that many of the routes, things like YC, you know, getting your Sequoia, you know, big Series A, in many ways that has reached that same level of like formalism that you know, what the numbers came out, YC is accepting more and more people from Stanford, more people with degrees. It leads to a consensus driven. It's now a route for strivers in the same way that going into the city was. And how do you, again, where do you sit on that?
Yeah, it's definitely become tracked in some ways. I'm sure they're aware of this and trying to find ways around it, but perhaps also from an investment point of view, it works well enough. I don't know if we would ever necessarily risk that too much, because the numbers of people that can join are very low. And so at the moment, we definitely are more of an opt-out than a sort of something that people do because they're looking for sort of prestige or because it's the done thing. Partly because it's such a long thing, you have to commit for quite a long time. So when people are adding up the benefits, like prestige is never actually enough of a driver in our case, because we just don't have enough of it. So at some point that may become a problem, and you end up with people sort of badge collecting or something like that. But we also don't have a very structured environment for people. It's very exploratory. So a lot of people might come and then, because if you're chasing prestige, it's usually because you want your inputs to have more clear outputs. You want to know that if I do X, then a range between Y and Z will probably happen. And that's sort of why a lot of people will go to really good universities, or they'll join really successful companies, because it's clear to them that they can have like predictability in what they do. And because we don't really offer that here, because it's much more of a like social and then like wandering experience, then hopefully that reduces it somewhat. I've not actually thought about it that much because we've just not had it as a problem yet.
Yeah, I mean, and on this question, right, of, you know, we've had the non-hereditary, it's, you know, you have that spirit. This does lead to, I mean, I think some would say a certain like exploitation of the commons, right? Because if you're coming up and you look out and you say, right, I've been in the sort of Thatcherite way, right? I've come through fairly difficult circumstances. I haven't necessarily been handed the easiest of situations. I'm going to like see the world in a more clear way and leap on it. And I think this is what people said about Pump, right? Is that it is exploitative in the way that like you are driving people to be, destructive or create destructive products, basically using virality. Would you say that's right?
So just to the question, first of all, I think the idea of the commons as this like amorphous blob is probably not the best way to look at these things. And I think René Girard had this idea of this priestly caste as exploitative or somewhat extractive or manipulative of the common people or something along those lines. And his sort of counterpoint to it, which didn't necessarily resolve the problem, but at least added some nuance to it, was that all these priests have to come from somewhere. They come from the same society that they're being claimed to manipulate. So there's much more of a reflexive relationship between sort of the people who come from more humble beginnings and then those that they interact with. So I don't think it's very easy to pigeonhole. Given that you mentioned Pump as potentially exploitative, I would say that, first of all, they are very similar to many other very successful companies, except they didn't need to take on huge amounts of venture capital funding from big established names who control a lot of the media production around startups and who can really set the narrative. They sort of essentially control both capital and media, and they can use that massively to their advantage. Like extremely influential and extremely smart people, that they know how to sort of pump their own bags.
They're not. Yeah, Pump Up. They're not going to be invited on TVPN, right?
No, and I don't think they would really. Maybe they would appear on it, but maybe TBPN is almost a top signal. They've done an amazing job as a media company, and it's really, I actually really enjoyed it. But really, it's like a finance bros podcast, just like fun. It's sort of like finance bros in finance bros clothing. It's very much like the financialization of tech, and almost commoditization of tech. Really love the podcast, but it's not really where I'd expect many of our members to end up until they reach a certain stage, because just on the Pump point, they never needed to take that venture capital. They did raise over $1 billion, but that was much later on. That was at sort of like a $4 billion valuation or something. And they have just been unapologetically successful. So it's very easy to attract envy when you're making over $1 million a day and you are pretty honest. You know, people often say rudeness is like this terrible thing, and in some cases it is, but often it's just honesty, and sort of the reverse of this is like putting on a suit and selling someone a financial product in one form or another. So they're really just honest about it. I would say actually, in terms of exploitation, it's a lot of the companies that were selling tokens and stuff like that and claiming that they had this like huge future potential, and they were very dishonest in how they attracted retail users onto their platforms. I mean, for example, Revolut is an amazing product, an amazing company, and it's a shame that they don't get as much praise as they deserve. But if you look at their revenue numbers, almost all of it is from crypto trading, but no one ever calls Revolut exploitative. Perhaps that's because they're considered to create more value than someone like Pump. But then if that's true, then the market caps correspond accordingly. And so I wouldn't actually call Pump exploitative. What they've done is just opened up a whole new market and actually perhaps reduced the amount of speculation in altcoins, let's say, because people have started to question the actual value of a lot of these things.
Okay, well, I mean, and a more fair one, and is they're using the sort of system as it is and being very hard-nosed about it, right? Like maybe the reality is that actually we don't like the world that we live in where Pump is possible.
I'm not particularly puritanical about this stuff, so I don't fully align in this regard. I think that people have an awful lot of fun on Pump.fun, and their whole mission is just to be the funnest place on the internet, and they're making money from that because they're doing a good job of it. And the easiest way to assess a company is how much money do they make, because it shows that someone values it somewhere. And maybe we disagree with whether that's something that's of value or not, but if you want to have sort of a free society, then you're going to have people using products that you don't like.
So yeah, I mean that I suppose is the question. Do you think then there's a sort of moralizing? There is a moralizing force that people kind of look at it and go, "Oh, you're doing the wrong thing," but actually, frankly, like the virtue is that you're doing something that people want, or do you think there are products that frankly we shouldn't make? I mean, I wrote down in my notes, like, is this the new like Magnus Maximus, the British Roman emperor who one of the last, but is also the nail in the coffin, right? Like he achieves his glory, but he takes the legions away from Britain, and that's what results in the end of British, like Britain being a member of or part of the Roman Empire.
My Roman history isn't as good as it once was. My main sort of, I'm much more biased to have like a Tacitus-led view of most of these things, where actually the biggest issue was people just very gradually like eroding liberties and stuff like that, and doing it in a very sort of subtle way. So I wouldn't think that. I think probably the nails in the coffin had already been, like, the coffin was already prepared by the time Magnus Maximus arrived, and there are obviously sort of structural issues there. But I mean, I'm not sure entirely how relevant that is to the conversation, where I think Silicon Valley is probably the most hilariously sort of narrative distorting area that you can have, where sort of a lot of these really successful companies are perceived now to be doing really important things. No one would ever think that Google is an exploitative company, for example, or maybe they do now, but certainly not in the past, when essentially they're just an advertising company. And if you break down their revenue, almost all of it comes from advertising. And the reality, and perhaps I shouldn't speak openly about this, but the reality is that it's much easier and probably much better in terms of sequencing to do something that's revenue generating and makes money first, and then do something important, because you can't do the reverse very easily. You might cure cancer, but you might not then be able to actually distribute it at scale if there's no business model attached. So the whole thing with whether this is a good company or not is something that millions and probably hundreds or even billions of dollars go into to try and shift public perception, probably especially in the wake of Microsoft being potentially, when there was the whole monopoly antitrust stuff in the early 2000s, a lot of people live with that sort of rent-free in their minds. So Silicon Valley have done a great job at sort of trying to shift public perception around what products are good or not. Probably in the end it's for the government to decide, but I would just be skeptical of how many things are unambiguously good. There are very few things that are unambiguously good that also make money.
Well, can we come at this from a more HomeDAO perspective? Are you trying to create things that have social value, or are you trying to create things that have a big market cap, or somewhere in between?
So I read an interesting take on social entrepreneurship and things like that, which is that basically people tend to not achieve either of their objectives, either making money or any social impact. And I'm pretty skeptical of people who are talking about like doing things that are clearly socially valuable, because if they are, then probably there's enough people already doing them. And so it's not about, is this good for society? It's more about, why does no one else think this is good for society? For example, Anduril was considered to be terrible for society when they started, but actually now it's a pretty valuable thing to have for most people. I think most people would agree that sort of history has not ended, and actually military stuff is important.
Well, we're in a kitchen surrounded by drones that one of your members is making. Doesn't it excite you to see drones in this kitchen?
It does. I mean, what excites me more is from my personal perspective, is to have my assumptions challenged on like quite a regular basis. And very often people will be working on things that I might viscerally respond to in a negative way at first, and then when I hear the reasoning behind it, I can be convinced in a different direction, or see the differences. I think sort of social value, because you have to define society first to then really figure out whether something has social value or not. If someone creates OpenAI and that takes loads of jobs away, is that social value? Well, I would say probably it is, because you're increasing the leverage of future generations. There's sort of Brian Johnson, the guy that wrote Don't Die.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, he had his whole thing is around quoting. Was it Adams? I can't believe I've forgotten who it was that said this, but the idea of sort of, I study politics and war, so my sons can study mathematics and philosophy, something like that.
Yeah.
And it goes all the way down until people are studying like porcelain and like fine art and stuff like that. So my framework for what is good for society is things that automate in the stack so that we can focus on higher leverage things or things that are more beautiful or things like that. And most of the companies in HomeDAO have done something along those lines. They've sort of added a layer of sophistication to our like civilisational stack in some way or another. So even if you look at like the human body, a lot of it is automated. We don't think about hopefully we don't think about most of our bodily processes. We don't really need to worry about whether we're breathing or not and all the rest of it. We can focus on things that have higher cognitive load. So yeah, like it's similar to things like self-driving, for example. Yes, it will take away taxi drivers' jobs, but if we can find better things for them to do with their time, it's probably better than them being sat down for 12 hours a day and dying young.
I wonder how that fits in, because you say civilisational, right? Like how that fits in with, say, Andoril or China, right? Where it requires you to have some concept of the other and the enemy or the separation.
Palantir in particular.
Palantir as well is an interesting one. Like what is you mentioned the government as the sort of source of legitimacy, and I think your point about social value, entrepreneurship is a very good one. A whole lot of people there are basically complaining that the thing they want to do is not producing money. So yeah, tough luck. But clearly you have to draw the line somewhere, and you have to say, the government or someone is going to define that this is the way that we do things. And what's your sense on that? Like, is it just the role for government through a democracy, like mediated government, or would you say this if you were Chinese and you think it's just a case of like one has a loyalty to one's own civilization?
So it's an extremely complicated debate. I would say that the most diplomatic way to think about it, which might also be the best way to think about it, is that there are sort of these events where one has to other in order to have a sense of self, but equally from a sort of civilizational perspective, often technology, even if it's dual use, can just lift the bar worldwide. So that's actually one of the challenges of investing in technology from a national perspective, is that if everyone can just copy it, then what advantage do you have of putting all the money up? It's sort of a game theory problem. And Peter Thiel talks about this a little bit in 0 to 1, like the challenge of globalization being that everyone just copies, and then what's our incentive to invest more if everyone's just going to copy and be 1 year behind all the time? But it's definitely true that there are some things that sort of do just lift everyone out of poverty in one way or another, whether it's like a material poverty or sort of occupational poverty in one form or another. And so you can have things that are just good for human civilization more generally, rather than, let's say, British civilization or something like that. Drawing the sort of boundary lines is where it gets really difficult, and I've not thought enough about that to have any really big insights. It's also probably just something we can't do on our own. It's like a very collective endeavor.
Are there any technologies that you're particularly interested in or excited about in this regard, where do you think they could add value to civilization somehow?
So probably the one that has more attention than before is quantum. Anything related to quantum seems to be...
One of your members, or you've had some members who worked on quantum computing, right?
Yeah, quite a few people actually have explored this area. It's really difficult, which is perhaps one of the reasons it's more interesting, and it's got perhaps proportionately less hype. It's a word that you hear a lot in common parlance, but...
Don't you need like incredibly expensive hardware to make it work? Like how can someone in a kind of monastic hacker house sort of thing make a dent in the arc of progress?
Yeah, this is the challenge of the monastic model does have relevance to lots of different industries. It's not just exclusive to things that need software, but there are also some things that require just much higher capital, upfront expenditure, basically. Oxford does have some great labs and stuff like that. Perhaps you actually just need to be as resourceful as possible, in which case being in a hack house environment is very valuable. I don't think anyone in this current cohort is going to end up doing something quantum related, so it's again not something I've thought about too much, but it just seems to be one of those things that could create a really big step jump.
Maybe I'm just being a decel and assuming that there's actually no way of making progress without having all that capex. maybe that's just the wrong attitude.
Yeah, I suppose it's like, how do you get that capital in the first place? Probably there are some steps you could take to get there, and you could still take those steps whilst living in HomeDAO or something like that. It's definitely not prohibitive, and you're in one of the best places in the world to do it, because there's a lot of stuff going on in Oxford and just in Britain in general around that. Beyond quantum, I really try not to think about like verticals in general, because it's sort of, obviously from an indexing point of view that can be really valuable, but it's more just ideas within those verticals that interest me. Often they're just brought to me by members and stuff like that. So
Are there any projects being worked on by your members now that you think are particularly exciting?
no, not at all. No. Yeah, of course there are. I'm not really going to sort of shill them on this podcast. I think it would be lacking in decorum to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Which of the 18 is cleverest?
Yeah, probably for your audience, obviously drones are pretty cool.
Do you know what these drones here are designed to do?
So there are lots of different potential use cases. None of them are currently military, thank God. But the business model around them is currently being explored. I'm not really at liberty to say. I can say that the person working on them has recently surpassed the Guinness World Record for hover time, and is only 19, so he's really.
So how long is that?
It's a few hours, yeah.
Wow.
I think the challenge with a lot of drones at the moment, hovering, like rotor-based drones.
Well, the batteries must be.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. So he's really good with batteries as well, and so, like battery recycling.
So he's made his own batteries.
I'm not sure if he made them for the drones in particular, but he has recycled batteries
Can you
from
tell us
EVs.
how he made his hovering drone the best?
I think
in
it was
history?
mainly around like optimizing the payload.
So it's very, very light,
yeah, extremely lightweight,
but also won't get buffeted by the wind.
right. Yeah, it's challenging, but I think if people are just passionate about things, then it doesn't feel like work when they're doing them, and so it can be done. Like it's sort of like being surrounded just by really passionate people. It doesn't actually matter what they're passionate about as long as it's productive.
Bro, we should get this guy in to do the KC3 for us.
Get to clean the cobwebs up at the top of the hall that we can never reach. I'm interested there. You say about the like, if you're surrounded by interesting people, that's like enough, right? That's which raises the question of if like money and stuff is just a way of keeping score. You know, if the revenue and the capital is a sort of, you know, it's a leaderboard, right? Who was able to execute best? Who was able to produce the thing that was most important? Like, then to what extent, like, is tax and a wealth tax relevant? You know, Britain seems to dislike talent and seems to want to cut people down. Clearly, there's a sort of shift that happens maybe in these entrepreneurial people where you maybe start and you're in this hacker house, and then at some point you maybe go, I'd actually quite like to have a family, and I'd quite like to. Your priorities change, right? Like, what's the sort of arc, do you think, of these founders, and why does, when you leave or when you decide to move out of that kind of sphere of thought and way of focusing, like, why does Britain remain like inhospitable to that?
I don't know if Britain necessarily does remain inhospitable. I'm not entirely sure on which part of the question to answer.
Yeah, sorry, I said a lot of things, and I'm not sure if there was a question in there, but do your best.
Yes. So I think probably it's again too early to say where the alumni end up in their sort of life trajectories, because we've only done one cohort so far. We're on our second cohort now, and we're all still very young. I would assume it would be pretty varied. Like, high variance is often a sort of feature of life here, so I would assume that would continue. Whether, I suppose the thing around tax is essentially, if it's just about keeping score in terms of how like impactful your work has been or something like that, then maybe you should pay a 90% tax, because really after a point you've made all the money you could possibly need, and so paying tax doesn't really matter. It's just like a rounding error in terms of your lifestyle costs, at least, unless you're really lavish, which no one really is so far. Like, even people who've made like really considerable sums of money have not changed their lifestyles at all, as far as I'm aware. So there is an argument for that. I think that the counterpoint is that wealth tends to compound capital compounds in a way that is basically completely killed if you have an excessively high tax rate. If you have a fair tax rate, and then deciding on that is obviously really difficult, then you can see sort of these compounding gains to wealth, where I think Warren Buffett became exceedingly wealthy only towards the very end of his career, and it was just this constantly compounding thing for a long time. And there's this great Charlie Munger quote, which is something like, never interrupt compounding unnecessarily. It's something on those lines. And lots of people think in those terms, and they sort of optimize their whole decision-making frameworks around that. So they just see it in terms of an optimization problem. So that's one counterpoint. And then the other one is probably where the money is going is also actually quite important. So you could argue that in some cases, if a government is really wasting money, then there's a moral obligation on this. I personally wouldn't argue this. I think it's too self-serving to argue it in good faith. But some people might argue there's a moral obligation not to pay taxes to a certain government, because they might think that that government is going to waste the money and they could donate it to a charity that's actually more impactful. So maybe if we had a much more transparent system of taxation or of expenditure, then people would be more willing to get involved.
I mean, Tyler Cowen, I think, writes in Stubborn Attachments about the moral case for giving money to the rich, because they are then more likely to increase, like the compounding effect or the ability to increase capital among the wealthy is actually greater, and thus you will produce greater long-term outcomes.
Yeah. This is an interesting argument. I do think that it's going to be a problem. Like the recent New York elections of Sarah and Mamdani, I think people were talking about how this point had been made about people are not going to be in favour of capitalism if they don't have any capital. And the current sort of wealth to money to credit ratio, combined with the inequality, wealth inequality that we currently have, probably will be problematic, I think. So I'm not sure if that would actually...
And yet there was the thing about Britain having the most progressive tax rate in the world. Do you see this? That Britain and the US have the most progressive tax rate at the moment in terms of redistribution, and yet people it doesn't seem to have produced...
A lot of people falling into the higher tax rate.
Well, exactly. It doesn't produce contentment.
You better watch out with your PhD stipend.
Well, it seems more like a sort of squeezed middle phenomenon, where you have... all the people who can avoid it do avoid it, or most of them do, I assume. And then anyone who's on a high income, like it's usually income tax that's taxed, that is the biggest proportion of the country's, like, or the tax revenue. But that's obviously really easy to just milk and sort of exploit, because it's very hard for people to leave if they've got a family or if their job is tied to London or something like that. So it's probably still not very fair overall.
But how do we make life easier for the talents who, according to your worldview, are creating the value that everyone benefits from?
I don't know if their life needs to be particularly easier. I think sort of adversity can be very valuable for sort of self-growth.
So we should make housing and electricity even more expensive.
Yeah, that would actually probably be really... I can't see any good reasons to not make electricity cheaper, and just energy cheaper. That would probably be one of those like macro benefit things you could do that unlocks a lot. Kind of like AWS or Azure just creates this new set of companies that are now viable. Probably in the same way we could have a lot more with cheaper energy. Maybe nuclear needs to be re-explored. I saw an interesting theory around why nuclear power was not explored. I don't know if you did this in like GCSE physics, but when they talked about why everything was shut down after Chernobyl, it seemed sort of like one of those explanations that wasn't really adequate, and it seemed like surely clever people would find a way around this. So usually it's because there's something else going on as well, and apparently it was to do with not realising when they were being built, but realising afterwards that nuclear power plants could also be turned into nuclear weapons, or there's some transferability that was not obvious at the time, and they didn't want everyone to have nukes, but equally they can't deprive people of nuclear energy if they have it, because of that energy poverty.
But this explains why the third world can't have nuclear energy.
Basically, yeah.
But we pioneered it in this country.
Yeah.
So was this like a general? Is the theory that like there was a general worldview shift against nuclear because of this risk in introducing nuclear power to new countries?
Yeah, essentially, yeah, because I think that may have led to India and Pakistan ending up having nuclear weapons, and I don't think that was a desired outcome at the time.
No, I think it's kind of murky as to how they got them, but maybe the Russians gave them some advice.
I'm not sure. I lived with a nuclear scientist a long time ago and sort of discussed this with him a bit. He was actually from India, so it was very difficult for him to travel anywhere, and it's one of those things that almost is quite under discussed, I think, at the moment. It seems like probably it will become more important in the next few years, but
there's okay. So you say almost that you don't want to make these people's lives easier, but do you not want them to be able to meet other people like them? Like what's the way that you don't get rid of the adversity that is needed to sort of induce brilliance?
Well, they should join HomeDAO for sure. There's no doubt about that.
But like, how do you get brilliance whilst maintaining adversity, but also not making things so easy that it becomes like a sort of striver class way of just doing all the steps and ticking all the boxes?
Yeah, so the risk is always of like iatrogenics, sort of like interventions that cause more harm than good, like caused by the healer essentially. So some people argue that SEIS and EIS have essentially done that, where it's a really well-intentioned policy, but it just encourages people to invest in companies that are going absolutely nowhere, and then just deprives people of more honest feedback loops, essentially. One thing that would probably be really valuable would be bringing back grammar schools. That's something that I think at a sort of very macro national level would be really valuable. Give people a sense of what being in a high performing environment looks like from a very young age, because we probably miss out on a lot of talent just by virtue of what postcode people were born in. So the narrative around getting rid of grammar schools was that comprehensive schools are much more open and accessible and anyone can go to them, but they essentially just become private schools by postcode. You just the mortgage prices or the mortgages for the houses reflect the quality of the schools in the area, and so it's just like a bidding war for who can pay to live in places with good schools. That seems to be really important. I think Dominic Cummings is working on something around that, and there've been some really good initiatives like King's Math School. I think, that seems to have been really good. I'm really not a policy person, to be honest, because it just seems actually really hard to have good policies for things. Probably just getting out of the way of people is like reducing obstacles rather than adding things on would be nice. But honestly, like most of the entrepreneurs that we've worked with and that have joined HomeDAO, and even just people that I know, they don't tend to complain about like the systemic issues that much.
That was the thing that Shiv Malik said to us, right? Was that actually you see a real decline in people post sort of Occupy protests talking about systemic or making systemic complaints. And I wonder whether, I suppose, again, it's probably a good thing for an entrepreneur to do, right? Is not to regard the system as an obstacle, but rather see it as it is and like how they have to get through, which is maybe an obstacle to this like broader, what people talk about the tech VC, like me coming into the policy world, that actually it's a set of ideas and like principles that are very poorly matched. Because probably the better founder you are, the less willing you are, in your greengrocer's daughter kind of example, the less willing you are to take a systemic view.
Perhaps. Probably it's just really, really broad. It would take probably a PhD to actually have really high conviction on it.
Let's look ahead then. Imagine Britain 50 years from now. What could it look like if we embraced talent in this country?
I suppose there's two ways I think about it, from an aesthetic perspective and then from a sort of material point of view. So materially, we could just have much higher salaries per capita and much more comfortable lifestyles. So like, the declining birth rates that we currently see could actually be a blessing in disguise, and from an economic point of view, because they could massively incentivize more automation. So if people really, I'm quite bullish on automation just in general. It seems like very, very good overall. Not necessarily specialization. Like there's this creative like specialization is for insects. So maybe it would allow people to actually be more generalist if there's more automation around them. But with declining birth rates, you can see. So the analog that is quite interesting is in the Black Death, Britain was like absolutely destroyed on a population level by the Black Death because we had very densely populated areas, so it could spread really quickly. Whereas Russia didn't have the same issue overall. And the theory is basically that this reduction in human capital led to much greater investment in like actual like industrial capital in Britain. So agriculture became more efficient, and this sort of culture of efficiency continued up until the Industrial Revolution, which meant that sort of Marx and Engels thought, okay, the next step of this would just be people don't work, basically, and you've just got so much abundance because you've automated so much. Whereas the Russians, because they never had that population hit, even though at the time they were like, oh great, we don't need to sort of reinvent our system anymore, we can stick with this sort of feudal or like serfdom structure. What actually happened was it just really limited them into the future. So that sort of the acute pain of experiencing population decline was substituted for a chronic pain of just surplus labour, and that's probably the most bullish argument I've come across for currently developed countries, first countries that have very high birth rates and very young populations. So you go somewhere like India, it's actually really quite high energy because everyone's so young, and that's a quality in and of itself. But you also have really menial tasks that are being performed by people that they can't actually automate because it would leave too many people out of work, and so it could limit the sort of sophistication of their economy quite a lot. So I would be really bullish on ways to manage the birth rate problem and the sort of gerontocracy that we're potentially, is that the word, gerontocracy? That we're potentially going to end up with by having a really agentic younger group of people who can automate for a lot of the issues that we have, rather than having to sort of.
But each of them has got to be worth kind of 3 decrepit boomers.
Well, yeah, this is the challenge, and this is what's quite exciting. I think it can be done because you can pull technology from all around the world as well as invest in your own, and you could have robots that do a lot of the stuff that people would otherwise do. So I don't think it might not even be sort of, this is probably a little bit more sort of futuristic, but it might not be the big challenge that we think it is in the longer term. For us, sort of material comfort and stuff like that, yes, it probably will be an issue, but for the future of the country as a whole, it will probably be quite interesting.
So we've just got to keep our shit together until the automated cavalry arrives.
Well, no, we've got to build the automated cavalry. We can't just expect it to
The cavalry's not coming. We've got to build it first. Oh, no.
This is always the issue. Yeah, it's sort of probably the reason why some people end up with these like messianic complexes around why things need to be done is that there are so few people who actually try and do these things that it's almost, once you realize it needs to be done, you should probably start trying to do something, because otherwise no one else will. And maybe if you do it, you'll inspire other people to help as well. Because that's sort of like the materialist view of, we could have a really green and really pleasant land if we really go all in on things like automation, and if we're willing to endure actually quite significant economic hardship to get there, or at least reprioritization of things. But because that's essentially what seems to have happened in the Industrial Revolution, is that there was awful amount of upheaval. You know, if you read Tolkien, he's like really regretful of a lot of the changes to the English landscape and things like that. But probably there's like a sort of argument where you actually have to change in order to conserve anything in the first place.
Run as fast as you can to stay still, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So unless you want Britain to just become like a theme park for tourists from like America and Asia, then if you want it to actually be relevant in some way and a prosperous place, then it will be painful in the process. But then sort of aesthetically, there's a really interesting. I don't mean to sort of criticize Anglo-futurism at all, because I'm sort of really bullish on Anglo-futurism. But one of my friends was talking about how, from a sort of fundamental perspective, Anglo-futurism is like the right-wing version of UK aesthetics, in the sense that it's almost schizophrenic in its like putting of a thatched cottage on the moon and stuff like that. And obviously a lot of this is in jest, so I don't think it's always a fair criticism, but probably aesthetically I'm sort of reminded more of like Warhammer 40k when I think about like the Anglo-futurism stuff, and a sense of like continued cultural relevance and sort of global relevance for Britain has this own aesthetic to it, which isn't like fully clear in my mind. Most aesthetics at the moment seem to be actually really like distorted and not very coherent, but it would probably be something like refined version of Anglo-futurism that we see in like the current AI-generated memes.
So what could it actually look like then?
Well,
It's not gonna be...
I think probably more neo-Gothic. Like this is really interesting. I came across literally just today the Ruskin thing about it's something about the Gothic. I can't remember what the book's called. You'll be able to find it really easily. And there was something to do with because the forms of the Gothic weren't like as strict or as straight, they could only be made by free men. That was part of the narrative around Gothic architecture. And you see a lot of like neo-Gothic architecture from the Victorian era. So probably tourists come to London and they think that Palace of Westminster was built like 1,000 years ago when King Arthur was going around and stuff like that. But I'm pretty sure it was built pretty recently. And we could have similar kind of things where we actually take the past and innovate on top of it in a more coherent way, as opposed to these really hubristic architecture that you see with like post-war things. It was probably just we ran out of money and we didn't know how to like create a philosophy around we ran out of money, so we're just going to build these crap buildings. So instead they created things like postmodernism and stuff like that. But it would be much nicer to see like Gothic architecture on the moon.
Neo-Gothic.
Neo-Gothic, exactly. Like
I think it's a good
energy efficient Gothic architecture.
Triple glazed Gothic. I think
Triple glazed stained glass.
I think it's a good point though about the like we have this like inability to come up with new aesthetics, and that actually maybe actually the point is that Anglo-futurism is the cry, right? Is like these images are, you know, if they make you feel that they're tacky, get on and make something yourself, right? And someone made the point to me the other day that the problem is that a lot of tech people, when they think about culture, for them it's one of, oh, we have to make it, because that's always how they think, right? Oh, if we're lacking something, I'll just make it. And clearly that's not how these things work. And again, there's a real problem of how do you create any sense of a coherent like aesthetics when people are living such, you know, nigh on schizophrenically different lives.
You probably needs like a very strong avant-gardist like cultural reformation or restoration maybe. But with that would also probably come different forms of acute pain as well, because naturally to have a sense of self or identity there needs to be some degree of exclusion as well. I don't know. I'm not really very culturally literate, so I couldn't say for sure. But I would look at sort of the Oxford architecture, and if you look at Keble College, that now looks like quite an Oxford building. But at the time it was built, it was very controversial because its sort of colour scheme didn't fit with the rest of the university.
It was set to look like a railway station.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of there was this movement to get rid of Keble. If you joined the society, you had to bring them a brick from Keble.
I was at St John's and I actually stole a brick.
Really?
Did you?
Yeah.
So maybe actually
It's many years ago now, so I can finally disclose it.
Maybe the sort of
Maybe there's a statute of limitations on this crime.
maybe the restoration.
I didn't like chisel it out of the wall.
What did you do? How did you go?
I think they were rebuilding a bit of it, and I came upon it at night, and I was 3 sheets to the wind, and I saw that there were some bricks that they hadn't like put back in or something, or that can't remember if it was a new brick or whatever. But I grabbed it without thinking and stuffed it under my coat, and then kept it in my fireplace from then on.
So potentially, actually,
trophy.
Keble shouldn't sleep too soundly at night because there could be a revamping of this. I don't know. They're probably.
Well, I'm back in Oxford, and I've got plenty more bricks to take.
Well, now that people have
One
heard this
down,
on the podcast,
2 million to go.
Yeah, it was just. I don't know. I mean, there are lots of other easier targets like St. Cat's or something like that would probably get hit first. But
It's a more deserving target of destruction. But these are kind of huge masses of. Well, it's not brick, right? It's not like as modular. What's it even made of? Like huge,
Small modular
chunks
colleges.
I mean, I do actually like St. Cat's, to be fair, and I've got a lot of friends from there. I don't want to start some like civil war, but what they've done well is that they've kept it far away from the centre, and probably as far as you can go without seeming incongruous is like Queen's College, where it's very neoclassical, but to the average person it doesn't look like too far away from the Oxford architecture. So probably it just needs to be a little bit more constructive rather than like antonymical. Would that be the word? Sort of, that wouldn't be the word, I don't think. But sort of, at the moment, it seems like most architecture is done just to make a big point and make a splash. So yeah, maybe we can work on like some Anglo aesthetics. Yeah.
Well, I think we're now well beyond any of our areas of comfort. Having exhausted the things we can talk about, we've
You've come on this tangent very gamely with us.
Is there anything else that you want to tell our listeners before we wrap up?
No, to be honest, no. We've talked quite a lot. Nothing immediately comes to mind except you can look into more of what we're doing at home-dao.com and.
Because there are still places, aren't there? You're still rolling applications.
We accept people throughout the year. Most of the cohort is already here. So if you're interested in doing something very high leverage and impactful and being surrounded by a peer group that thinks in the same way, then for sure you should apply and sort of find out more.
Send some Anglo-futurists your way. Josh,
more than welcome.
Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, and goodbye to our listeners.